Hi everyone, welcome back to SwitchUp. This is the series where we go back over the previous month, looking at the games that we reviewed and those that scored the highest. If any of these tickle your fancy, do let us know, but also consider picking them up using our discounted code SwitchUp over at switchup.gg, where you can buy your eShop credit. I'm not overly upset about Zelda being delayed, honestly. There are so many good games, and maybe as one person said, they're trying to avoid the Game of the Year competition, Elden Ring. This one's usually voiced by Glen, but as you know, he's not well at the moment, so he'll be doing the editing. What were the highest rated games that we reviewed on the channel last month? Well, let's find out. Initially, we've got Chocobo GP, or Chocobo, and it had all the elements of what would have made it a great kart racer. Unfortunately, Square Enix had decided to overlay the entire experience with a very mobile-like, free-to-play style system. It meant that favourite characters such as Cloud were incredibly difficult to earn unless you decided to spend real-world money, and let's put it this way, I wasn't overly enthused by that in my review. I wasn't alone in this, and many in the community let Square Enix know that this wasn't ideal. They've since released a statement backtracking on a lot of these mechanics, but they're not entirely removing them. So while it has made the top 10 in terms of score, if you're considering Chocobo GP, then download the free demo and give it a go yourself. It scored a SwitchUp score of 63%. Then there's Aztech Forgotten Gods. This is Lienzo's second game after the lovely Malacca, so many in the community were very excited about what they could produce. You control a female protagonist who has an ancient tech attached literally to her arm. This allows her to boost off the ground and fly through the air and jump from building to building. It reminded me of the game Infamous and had that real superhero feel to it, and in many ways it's a boss rush game. There are some incredibly enjoyable boss fights with multi-stage, reasonably complex mechanics. However, everything outside of combat feels a bit underwhelming. Combine that with some lackluster visuals and performance on the Switch version, and while I did enjoy the narrative, there's also a couple of camera issues. The boss fights were the redeeming factor, and it scored 68%. In 8th position, we've got World Rally Championship 10, and as far as simulating a real-world rally experience, WRC 10 is as close as you're going to get on the Nintendo Switch. I did have a major issue with the game, as we'll go into, but they've made several improvements to the already excellent career mode. You can choose and create your own team essentially, and manage the entire experience from a hub area very similar to the last entry, but with a few tweaks. It essentially turns the rallying into an RPG experience. You'll earn currency which can be spent on upgrading your different skills and abilities, things like the speed at which your mechanics can work or the cost with which they can, and you'll be trying to impress different sponsors. Races take part over several new areas, and the inclusion this time around were the historical rallies based on very famous events. These are a nice addition, and as the game is essentially a 50th celebration, rally fans will lap up the new additions. That's a terrible pun. Unfortunately though, the visuals aren't great. It's particularly noticeable in comparison to some of the trailers. Nintendo released the official trailer just yesterday, and as you can see, it looks fantastic, almost like they've applied After Effects to the Switch footage to make it look more smooth. But when you have that alongside the real footage, well, I'll let you decide. Either way, I do wish they could get this looking at least as good as an older title like Grid on Switch, but that's proprietary engines for you, hit and miss. Still a good game, and it received a SwitchUp score of 75%. In 7th place, we've got Dawn of Monsters. It was a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you play as one of 4 available kaiju, fighting to save the Earth from a host of other monsters. The fact that the premise saw you playing as huge monsters, walking through entire cities and picking up buildings as weapons, did a lot to inject a fresh impetus into the beat-em-up formula, and fans of kaiju movies will definitely have some fun here. There are augments you can earn and equip to your monsters, which will boost your base stats, and the hand-drawn style was certainly appealing. The roster of kaiju was was a little limited though, and the fact that your character's size made you quite slow and meant you couldn't jump, whilst understandable from a logical perspective, did slow the game down a bit too much at times. Fun to be had, especially in multiplayer, and it got a SwitchUp score of 79%. We had a tie for number 6, so in joint 6th place was The Cruel King and the Great Hero. This was developed by Nipponichi Software and uses a very similar art style to their previous Switch title, The Liar Princess and the Blind Prince. Albeit gameplay wise, this time they've created a turn-based RPG. The aforementioned graphical style and heartwarming story combine to create an incredibly charming game, and there's a lot to unlock and collect too. It does perhaps lack a bit of challenge for veterans of the genre, but if you're looking for something that you can take on at a slower pace and enjoy the story, then this could be one to consider. It got a SwitchUp score of 81%. In joint 6th place, we had the excellent RPG beat-em-up Young Souls. This one was reviewed by Asdin on the channel, and he enjoyed the RPG leveling, the way that you could take these two characters and specialize them in any areas you choose, with the same abilities being unlocked by each, but with the player having the freedom to craft entirely unique builds. The combat was quick and simple enough, but with enough depth, including moves such as parries. Unfortunately, the Switch version had a number of performance issues, as without those, this would have been up there in the high 80s. Despite that, the visual style gave real life to each and every area, and the character designs as well as those of your enemies were all very appealing, and as such he scored it 81%. Coming in at 4th place was the Persona 4 Arena Ultimax game. Now, this fighting game first released in arcades back in 2013 before hitting the PS3 and Xbox 360 a year later, and the gameplay holds up really well after almost 10 years. The presentation's top notch and the controls feel smooth and responsive. The story can be quite intimidating for newcomers, with it being told through quite long visual novel style cutscenes, and there's quite a lot of competition on the Switch when it comes to fighting games, so these points may need to be considered. Still, it's a worthy entry onto the Switch fighting library, and perhaps it just opens the door slightly for Persona 4 Golden, at the very least, to come to the Switch. That's a question for another day though, and this one got a SwitchUp score of 85%. Which takes us into the top 3, and in 3rd place is Rune Factory 5. The highly anticipated 5th entry in the farming and combat based hybrid moved the series into full 3D for the first time, and we felt that the move to 3D really enhanced the combat and ARPG side of the game, while perhaps making the farming side feel a little more fiddly, at least initially, before acclimatizing to the change. That same addictive quality transcends through this entry, whether you're tending to crops, building extensions to your house, fishing, socializing, or battling enemies deep in a dungeon. It also felt as if the balance between farming and battling was the best it had ever been. On the more negative side, the item shortcut system could have been improved, and there are some performance issues, although to nowhere near the size of those encountered when it released in Japan last year. A huge amount of fun and a serious time sink if you want it to be, it got a SwitchUp score of 87%. In 2nd place was our most recent review, which was Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Kirby's first proper foray into 3D is a huge success, with all of his staple powers and abilities translating across brilliantly. It has that high level of Nintendo polish with a beautifully crafted world to explore and lots of collectibles to find. It really is a true celebration of the franchise, and a bit of a kickstart in some respects too, after the last Switch entry, Kirby Star Allies, was accused of playing it way too safe. All in all, a great game, which got a SwitchUp score of 89%. And in first place then, you probably already know it, it's triangle strategy. So often over the years we've had games promise for diverging stories or a non-linear path, and it just isn't the case. Triangle strategy takes the tactical role-playing game and encapsulates the quote, "Oh, what tangled webs we weave." There are so many paths that you can take, so many choices that will directly affect the future of your kingdom. Playing as the next lord of House Wolfort, and with the three kingdoms making up the titular triangle, constantly vying over a very precious resource, not only was the narrative hugely enjoyable, but it's one of the few games where I'd go back, play through the entire experience a second time and have it feel worthwhile. The combat itself is also very refined. Markers will indicate exactly where you'll be within enemy range, and these are demarcated with different colours on the ground. You'll gain a large retinue of companions, and each of them has their own skill trees, and you'll promote them using medals that have been earned on the battlefield. The soundtrack was absolutely sublime, and for me it's as good as a tactical role-playing game can get. There is a demo of this one, so maybe go check it out yourself, but I don't think it gives a full picture at all. Obviously, it's a very slow demo, it's the initial phases of the game, and it's worth noting that this title has a lot of exposition. It's part and parcel of the experience, so you may go an entire chapter with just one fight, and if that sounds like something you're not going to enjoy, then maybe this one's not for you. But as we can see across the board with the review scores, many people have loved it. It got a SwitchUp score of 95%. So that's it for the month of March. Turned out to be quite a decent one. We find that as the months go on towards Christmas, you get more and more releases and they just get more stacked. I think that's probably the main reason I'm not overly concerned that Breath of the Wild has been pushed back. With things like Xenoblade 3 coming out, that's going to take up a lot of time. Maybe it is a blessing in disguise. Thanks to all of you that watch the channel and to our patrons who support us each and every month. And as always, for all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys. See ya!